This is the Fifth Estate winning headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you might have missed this morning. But we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 3rd of April 2020 and I am 2J.
I'm Tom.
And I am GK, and in case you missed the headlines, here they are. In the Standard, why doctors are afraid for Kenya. In the Daily Nation, stop dancing with death.
Yes.
And in the Star, virus sounds death knell for burial rights.
Absolutely.
Shall we begin with the Standard? Why are the doctors afraid for Kenya?
No, oh my, I was reading this story and I couldn't believe it. Doctors are saying, we are working long shifts from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Some are saying we have not been trained to deal with corona. Well, look, I see it this way. Doctors in Italy are working 48-hour shifts. Doctors in America are working 48-hour shifts. Some of them have no protective gear. I am not saying you go about your job with no protective gear, but geez, we're in a new normal. Things are not as normal as they were before, and therefore we should be able to adjust. And you see again, you are saying you have not been trained to deal with corona. Fair enough, but you are a doctor. You've been taught how to deal with viruses. A lot of the doctors we're seeing in Europe, some of them are actually going to their laptops and to their phones and seeing how to deal with this thing. So yeah, I
do agree with what you're saying, but I do see it from 2 points of view. Of course, you would never send a firefighter, to the front of a fire without protective gear, because of course that's what's going to cause them to get injured or to die.
That's true.
So in the same way, doctors do expect that they would have protective gear in order to protect themselves. I mean, I'm sure many people have seen videos of doctors in the United States who are complaining that they're being put in wards which are, corona wards specifically, and they don't have masks, they don't have gloves, and they're feeling very uncomfortable because at the end of the day they have to go home and take care of elderly children. It's scary, and I don't think some of us understand the full breadth of that.
It is, but I think, I mean, in total, I think government then should take care of these doctors. If at all they're working longer, that's okay, but protective clothing then is a must.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also it's time for Kenya to begin thinking about capacity building. Doctors from China, friendly countries like Cuba. It's time to augment whatever is already going on. So it's a sad situation if there's only 6 doctors and 14 nurses at an isolation facility. I think that number needs to be ramped up.
Can I put a spin on this and be a bit conspiratorial? I think there's a different reasons why doctors in Kenya or in Africa should be different, and I'm going to give 2 instances. One, the UK reported this week that corona tests that came in from China were actually contaminated with corona itself.
Wow.
So you go to get tested for corona and instead you get corona. Second instance is some news reporters who were speaking in Morocco, and some French doctors were proposing an idea of testing new vaccines in Africa, and they said that they should do it in Africa where there are no masks, no treatments, and no intensive care. And they likened it to when they were testing vaccines for AIDS in the 90s, saying that they tested on prostitutes because they are highly exposed and don't protect themselves. So for me, that is more scary. Vaccines that may enter into the African market, and we don't know what they're for or who they've come from.
Yes, and what their impact will be.
Exactly.
We have a 3-part criteria that we use to break down the headlines. We ask ourselves, is it topical or speculative? Is it repetitive or groundbreaking? And is it thoughtful or just plain lazy? I think we can park that.
Yes.
They have valid reasons to be afraid as doctors, but we're also saying that there's their part that they can play. In the Daily Nation, stop dancing with death.
So this comes off the heels of CS Mutahi Kagwe getting very frustrated with Kenyans because a lot of people, as the death count is increasing, as the number of cases are increasing, Kenyans are simply not taking this seriously. They're going about their days as if nothing has happened. They're not social distancing. We don't know how effectively people are washing their hands. So I think a lot of this is, as the headline says, Kenyans are dancing with the possibility of death. How do we take this more seriously? How is this, targeted at people who should be more wary of what they're doing?
Absolutely.
And the CS, I think, announced that he's going to put a stop to people traveling up country for Easter or traveling between counties.
Which should happen.
From the look of things, Uhuru Kenyatta likes to make statements on Friday, and maybe today he will probably issue a total lockdown.
It's possible.
My hunch.
Also with the caution that, you know, a lockdown means different things to different people. Those in the suburbs, those who are well off, will be fine with a lockdown.
Yes.
But there are also, you know, places where a lockdown is just not tenable.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so in the star, virus sounds death knell for burial rites. And this is basically that authorities have forbidden night vigils, the disco matangas, the, you know, the prolonged ceremonies that have characterized a lot of burial rites in Kenya for different communities. So basically now, you know, 15 family members, not more than that, are allowed to come for the funeral. You have, you know, a whole paradigm shift in the way people are mourning. You don't have these prolonged mourning periods. You basically get it over and done with. And I think Kenyans are struggling with that. They're struggling with the fact that they used to have a week to raise money. And now you can't even meet for the harambes. So there's a lot of mobilization on WhatsApp. Just you know, the new normal.
That's true.
However, I highly think that traditionally they used to bury people quite quickly, and they weren't as prolonged as we're seeing. I think once colonial times came in, you had the whole church come in and prolong this period. But I know Kikuyu traditionally, if you were falling sick and looked like you weren't going to make it, you were just dropped in the forest.
Oh yeah, they would leave you there to die.
And moved on with life. So maybe we're going back to traditional habits by force. Who do we give the winning headline?
I say the Daily Nation. I like the idea of, you know, questioning Kenyans on dancing with death.
On dancing with death? I agree with you.
I'd go the Daily Nation.
Yes, Kenyans, stop dancing with death, please. And that gives us our winning headline. On to the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country, where we also have a 3-part criteria that we use. We ask ourselves, is it humorous or dry? Is it satirical or pessimistic? And is it effective or just plain lazy?
Yes.
What do we have? In the Daily Nation, we have the Grim Reaper again, named COVID-19. And he has a sign that says, I need a lift. However, there is a Kenyan who is tiptoeing around and saying, stay at home. It can't move without us. And I think the idea behind social distancing is that we're trying to spread we're trying to contain and limit the spread of this virus, and it can only move with us.
Corona does not move, people do.
Exactly. So if you stop moving, Corona stops moving.
But for me, my question is, what will it take for Kenyans to be scared straight?
Do you know what I think Africans are thinking? They're thinking, and I was guilty of this about 2 weekends ago, and I said, when you have nyama choma and some booze, this thing, you'll be fine. But and the reason they're thinking Africans are not dying from this is because they're seeing so many numbers from Italy, or they're just seeing Muzungus dying. But the truth of the matter is this. Do you know, the only reason I think we are having low infection numbers is because Africa only has 2.2% of global air passenger traffic. Now, the Chinese travel like hell. The Italians, the Americans, they interact with each other much more than the African would interact with the world. And I think I think this ignorance should stop, and we should take this thing very, very seriously.
But what will it take for Kenyans to take it seriously? Because it seems like numbers aren't enough. Do they need to have a gun in their face? Like what will it take?
Precisely.
I think if you just even look at the numbers, some of the things that we've been tracking, in the space of about 4 days, we've gone from having an average case per day of 2.7 individuals, or 2.7 cases, to just yesterday, we've jumped to a record now of 5.2 average cases per day, right? Ooh. That means that possibly, if we're just projecting, that by the end of today, we're going to see about 150 to 160 total cases in the country, right? And they're saying that by next week, we'll be at about 1,000 cases. From what I've been projecting, by the 11th of April, we will be at 1,000 cases. Is that enough to scare Kenyans? I don't know.
It should be enough.
What this needs, Tujay, is a military lockdown. That's what will save us.
Well, possibly. Yeah.
Well, in the Star, we have a film set. And behind there you see Miss Tourism Kericho, Brenda Cheritich. And it says there on the clapper, I survived COVID-19. And there she is behind the clapper in front of the camera. Stick to the script is what it says. And then there's a man there with some toilet paper and there's some sanitizer on that side. Wow. And I think it's surrounding the controversy around patient zero, around Brenda and her story not adding up.
Yeah, I think people are very idle at home, trying to find out her past life. I mean, what's her personal life got to do with you? If she survived this thing, well and good. Just move on, man.
Yeah, I think Kenyans are just a bit afraid that the government is not telling them the whole story. I admit this story does not add up to me. There's too much for me to even understand what doesn't add up, but
just love Mushene. That's all you love.
Gossip. Yeah. All right. What do we have in the Standard?
The Standard, you have Gado, and it's a picture of the inverted globe. And I think what his point there is the global north is now Africa, and the global south is Europe. But is it telling us that with the world that Africa is now giving solutions to those that normally would give us help?
I don't know. But I think it also refers to, because I think the caption here is a Brave New World Order, which I think is in reference to a book by Aldous Huxley written in 1931. Right. And it's a dystopian book that talks about an era or point in time that we may reach where you have people being genetically bred, you have people being tested on pharmaceutically, not really understanding what is happening. And I think that kind of relates to this new, strange time that we exist in.
Absolutely.
So who do we give our winning cartoon?
I'd give it to Gado.
Yeah?
I'd give it to Gado.
To Gado?
Yeah.
I was thinking the Daily Nation, no?
I mean, since when would you have had Senegal, Kenya
being at the forefront?
Being at the forefront of helping the global north with solutions.
I mean, we saw, was it Somalia, I believe, was sending doctors to Italy.
To Italy,
Okay.
I mean...
Fair enough. I am convinced. There you have it. Our winning cartoon from the Standard, from Gado.
Yeah.
What is our final thought?
And now our final thought. It is inspired by a book entitled The Yellow Flag, Quarantine and the British Mediterranean World of 1780 to 1860 by Alex Chase Levinson.
Yes.
Summary.
Perhaps I give a summary.
Yeah.
So on Monday we began with the Spanish flu, and we looked at how some cities in America dealt with the pandemic, the 1918 Spanish flu that killed many people. And we saw how some people were proactive in doing, very quick social distancing, very quick lockdowns, whereas others carried on as normal and they ended up having high death rates. On Tuesday, we looked at the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and we looked at how the Soviets sort of came together initially to try and play down how grave the disaster had been, but also then how quickly they evacuated people once it was time to go. And then we saw on Wednesday how Egypt has been in a permanent state of emergency for almost 100 years, and the means in which it continues to keep that state of emergency going. And then yesterday, we looked at space quarantine. We looked at Apollo 11 astronauts coming back and staying in quarantine for about 21 days. And here we looked at the issue of how, scientists didn't know whether the moon was sterile when they came back. So they didn't know whether these guys were going to bring back germs that would, kill humanity. And so they needed to stay in isolation for a few days. And today we are looking at lessons of lockdowns.
Absolutely.
And poverty disparities, So The Yellow Flag, Quarantine and the British Mediterranean World, 1780 to 1860, written by Alex Chase Levinson. So in this book, Levinson, who's an assistant professor in history, looks at a historic and massive quarantine system that existed during the British Empire. So this system trapped every single person, ship, letter or trade good moving from the Ottoman Empire, which is modern day Turkey, Middle East, Southeast Europe, and Northern Africa. So just to go back to the title, Yellow Flag, it comes from the system of international maritime signals. So they would use plain yellow, black, or green flags to symbolize disease that existed on a ship or even on a port. So you'd see the ship come in, if it had the yellow flag, you know that they had a disease on board. But yellow has a longer historical precedent. And it is sometimes called the yellow jack. And funnily enough, that is actually where we get the name yellow fever from. So the author's interest in this topic came when he came across a guidebook from the 1840s that was written for British travelers who were going to Egypt. So a majority of the book he found covered how to deal specifically with quarantine when you're coming on a return trip. So the rationale here was that the occasional presence of a plague, like the bubonic plague, there was very few reports of how to deal with it as you were traveling back. So a lot of the time, people who were coming back from the Middle East were quarantined for 3 weeks. I think we mentioned this on Monday. So the author found that as far back as the 1700s, that's about 320 years ago, an international medical system existed. So this was cross borders. You had local health ports kind of working together. So it worked mostly by having those ground level bureaucrats in the Mediterranean port cities coming together. They regularly exchanged letters from local boards, and the point of this was that if everybody did not comply, you would have this mutually assured destruction emerge. So everybody had to disinfect together, otherwise you'd be spreading it across the globe. So these boards of health made it known to other boards that if your procedures are not up to scratch, you cannot dock at our ports. So it meant that everybody had to get on board together. So I think there are 3 things or 3 lessons that I took from this book. The first one is how the elite and national politicians were forced to go along with the procedures that these low-level bureaucrats came up with. So these are your, KPA authorities, these are maybe even your MCAs, people at the ground who are really in touch with what is going on. So they had developed these rituals and traditions of disinfection that most government ministers thought were over the top and within reason, because 90% of the ships that came in came from countries that had no evidence of disease. But these bureaucrats were so strict with how they operated that they said if the upper level ministers don't agree, it was the threat of trade completely stopping. The second major question that this book tackles is the responsibility of the modern state. So quarantine started as this cross-border necessity that eventually had to be integrated into how states operated. And so what you find is that you see that taxes needed to be put aside for medical purposes. And so the author concludes that quarantine policy worked most effective when politicians just stayed out of the way. Let the people at the bottom deal with what they have to do. And the last takeaway that really resonates with what we're dealing with Corona right now is a dramatically different way in which people of different classes experience quarantine. You have the upper classes who found it as a moment to self-reflect or to read a book or to have a glass of wine. But for the lower classes, this was really a terrible and difficult time where they were locked from doing what they needed to do to make money. And I think that's some of the things that you guys are going to cover.
So I looked at lessons from Italy. So we've seen Italy now become sort of the epicenter of this pandemic as it shifted from China. But Italy's experience shows steps to isolate COVID-19 and limit people's movement need to be put in place really early. And not only do they have to be early, you have to have absolute clarity with what you mean when you say lockdown. And also you have to strictly enforce it. In the very beginning, they were very lax. You had places like Milan saying Milan doesn't stop. They were still open for tourism and people were still open to, move about, which has caused, mayhem. But also you find that now you're finding that if you leave the house for no absolute reason, you're being fined, and you have to have a written reason as to why you are leaving your home. But in the early stages, we can see that the government and those in charge had critical missteps. There's things that they didn't do. And the reason they didn't do them is that because as a liberal democracy, the Italians were still trying to preserve these basic liberties as well as the economy. And I can see part of Kenya trying to do that now. You don't want a full lockdown because you're worried that people will not be able to go out and earn a living. And the rich are okay, they'll probably just shut down, watch TV or whatever it is. However, Italy's piecemeal attempts at cutting off this pandemic started off first with towns, then with regions, and then shutting down the whole country. Right now, you can still move around as Kenyans, but there's probably going to come a time when you can't move between county to county, and then there'll be a whole country shut down, essentially. And so in the early days of Italy's shutdown, you see that there was also a lot of confusion with messaging, and this created a false sense of security. And this might be why people are poking holes at Brenda's story, or at KJ, the MP, who came out and said that the numbers are looking this drastic. And it took people like Prof. Mutai Nguni to sort of poke holes and say, listen, someone needs to simulate how this crisis might look so that we can take this thing seriously. And also the other thing that they did was that government failed to communicate this threat. And I think that's where we can take up and change the trajectory of this thing by encouraging people to really stay at home. Now, South Africa, on the other hand, has just enacted its 3-week lockdown. And its lockdown looks very different from the Italian one.
Yeah.
They're imposing very tough and restrictive steps.
Yes.
So for instance, you can't jog outside.
Yes.
There's no sale of alcohol or cigarettes.
Wow.
And there's no dog walking.
Oh, gosh.
And the sales of alcohol and cigarettes, I think, is important because as Kenyans, I think we're still seeing a lot of parties being held and a lot of people having the parties within.
What will happen if you take away Kenyans' alcohol?
We will riot. We shall.
But South Africa is interesting and may mimic Kenya more because South Africa has the Kailishas and the Sowetos that have low income areas. Yeah. And how do you enforce hygiene and lockdown in some of those areas? So we'll be looking to see how they're managing to do it, but military is a huge part of it.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of shooting, a lot of beating and dehumanizing of people who are breaking curfew.
Oh, but let me tell you, some of the videos coming from South Africa are downright hilarious. Seeing people being told to frog march and to do exercises by the military.
Is it hilarious?
Is that hilarious to them?
Yeah, that's...
Can you do a frog march?
Yeah, very well. Yesterday I was doing star jumps. It's similar. Now, I'm going to give you guys the case of India.
Yeah.
And India is very much like Kenya, not in terms of numbers, but in how we are stratified demographically. And maybe Kenya should take some lessons from India. Now, why am I saying this? India has instituted a 21-day lockdown there. India has a country of about 1.3 billion people. 1 out of 4 lives under the poverty line. Now, the reason I'm also saying they are very much like us is because 85% of India's economy is serviced by the informal economy. And these are people who push rickshaws, or otherwise you'd like to call them kokotenis, maids, day laborers, people who would feed hand to mouth on on a daily basis. They don't have the savings, they have no buffer, and therefore if they're not working, then they have nothing to look forward to. But what has India done to alleviate these pressures? Number one, they have instituted a $23 billion cushion package, and this consists, they're giving everybody, 83 million families, cooking gas. All right, they're giving cash transfers to 200 million women of about $6 a month. That is nothing much. It's about 600 shillings. But they're also giving free rations, grains, and millet, whatever food rations they have. But also, let's also take this into consideration. India has one of the best health systems in the world, and maybe that is why they've been able to just have 56 deaths of corona in their country. But also, if India did not take precaution with corona, if they did not have a lockdown, India would have had 300 to 500 million people infected with corona by the end of the 3-month period. But I also want to I want to read an excerpt from The Guardian, you call it, an article that depicts the social strain between the rich and the poor in India. And I want to begin with the poor. And this guy, I've forgotten his name, you're going to see it on your screen. It says, the lockdown has stripped the poor of one thing that allowed them to hang on to a shred of dignity, and that is work. But I also want to give you what the rich are saying in India. It says, the fridge is well stocked with food. I very deliberately refused to do something cheap. There is more wine, along with single malt whiskey, vodka, and rum. I have some money in the bank. What contrast there? It shows how, and it's not just in India, this is across the board. You have fellows in the wealthy parts of the suburbs of Nairobi that are playing chess, are reading books, are watching movies on Netflix, but yet someone else across the other side of the divide is not living too well.
Yep, true words there.
Yep.
So yesterday we had a quarantine challenge. The answer is, she took a picture of her husband with an old school camera, and then she dipped it in water to develop, and then she hung it in a dark room, and then they went and they had dinner. Most of you may not know.
I don't even know what the question was.
What was the question?
You didn't watch yesterday, 2J?
Do you know what my answer would have been?
What would your answer have been?
I was going to say Wairi, and then I just say keep quiet.
Oh Lord. Okay, so for today's quarantine challenge, a doctor and a bus driver are both in love with the same woman, an attractive girl called Sarah. The bus driver had to go on a long bus trip that would last a week. Before he left, he gave Sarah 7 apples. Why did he give her 7 apples? Kindly let us know in the YouTube section. I like that one. But also subscribe to our YouTube channel and find us on TV. We're on GoTV, Prime Free to Air, and Star Times. And before I go, let me leave you with this. The reality of the coronavirus pandemic is that the battle will be fought, lost, or won in the country's poorest communities. Have a lovely weekend.